This week, we pick up where we left off last week with Knight and Rose desperately trying to make a historical case for the resurrection based on real history accepted by the vast majority of all historians, the Bible. Except the vast majority of historians don't simply accept that what is in the Bible is historical. Some things are, like Herod, Tiberius, Pilate, other people, and a number of places. But as to events in the Bible, few have sufficient evidence to declare them to be facts. Despite this, Knight and Rose are convinced that they have a robust case. Last week, we were told that everyone has a duty to examine the life of Paul and explain how he could possibly have had the change of heart that he had if he didn't see a real resurrected Jesus. Except I did just that and concluded that he likely felt guilty about the stoning of Stephen, which caused him to rethink what he had been doing. In support of this change of heart, Paul has a vision of Jesus directing him to do exactly what he did for the rest of his life. The change of heart caused the vision rather than an actual appearance of Jesus, causing him to have a change of heart. My theory requires no miracles and no presupposition that isn't mundane. The assumption that Paul changed his life based on a vision of Jesus not only requires a miraculous event, it isn't even supported by the Bible. Sure, the Bible reports both events occurring, but it never spells out the causation. Christians assume that the vision caused the change of life. Paul does say that as a result of his vision, he consulted with no human, but went to preach in Arabia as he was told to bring the gospel to the Gentiles by the vision. Nowhere does it specify that his change of heart came from the vision. We pick up with Rose claiming to have incredibly strong evidence for a resurrection based on the lives of the disciples. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members.
Of any religion, the disciples were in a position to know for sure what had happened. If they had made this up, they would not likely have been willing to lose everything and die for it. And there's no record of even a single one of them recanting. This is incredibly strong evidence.
There's no evidence of them not recanting either. That's because the evidence of any martyrs among the disciples is thin at best. It's mainly based on church tradition. Acts 12:2 records that James was put to death by the sword by Herod, and when he saw that this pleased the Jews, he had Peter arrested. It doesn't say that James was put to death for what he believed. It just says that Herod put him to death. Herod allegedly killed John the Baptist because he was pleased by his daughter's dancing and granted her a wish, and that's what she asked for at her mother's bidding. We have no reason to think that Herod put James to death for his beliefs, or that James could have saved his own life by recanting but didn't. And this is the best one that we have. Evidence of martyrdom of a few of the disciples is sketchier, and for most of them, it is non-existent. According to Christian Research Institute, there is the highest possible probability that Peter, Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the son of Zebedee, died as martyrs. There is less evidence for Thomas, although his martyrdom is more probable than not. There is slight positive evidence for Andrew. The evidence for the rest of the apostles is late, legend-filled, and contradictory. We simply don't know what happened to them. Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, were not apostles. Even from this Christian source, there is only a high degree of probability for the martyrdom of 2 of the 11 disciples. They claim a preponderance of the evidence for Thomas being a martyr and slight evidence for Andrew, and that leaves 7 of the 11, or 63%, that we simply don't know what happened to them. How can one possibly make the claim that one needs to be amazed at all these followers of Jesus dying for their faith when you have virtually no evidence for this claim as to nearly 2/3 of the disciples, and only slight evidence for an eighth? As to Thomas, according to Sean McDowell, the key question is whether or not this tradition is reliable. Did Thomas really travel to India, minister to the local people, and then face martyrdom? While scholars hold widely divergent views on the historicity of this question, there seems to be agreement that the evidence is not demonstrative either way. Justo Gonzalez says the tradition of Thomas in India leaves historians somewhat baffled. Eric Freikenberg says the questions of the historicity of the Thomas tradition are not easy to answer. L.W. Brown believes that the evidence is unsatisfactory. Part of the difficulty in ascertaining the truth about the Thomas tradition is that our earliest source, Acts of Thomas, is roughly 130 to 150 years removed from the events. Historically speaking, it must be admitted that this provides a significant challenge to the evidence. This is from Sean McDowell's PhD dissertation, A Historical Evaluation of the Evidence for the Death of the Apostles as Martyrs for Their Faith. Thus, Thomas is a ninth disciple for which the historical evidence of a martyr's death is severely lacking. You are down to two. Two of Jesus' disciples and two people who were later converts died for their faith. I would wager that the same claim could be made for many religions. So there really is nothing to explain here. Not only do we not know that any of the disciples claimed to have seen a resurrected Jesus, there is only historical evidence for two of the disciples and two later followers dying for this faith. What happened to the rest of the disciples? We simply don't know.
All we need for our case against this theory is that they were willing to die, not that all of them or even a majority of them died. Because I think historically speaking, it's not historically solid that we don't have all the strongest data for every one of their cases. We know that a bunch of them died. A bunch of them were willing to be killed for what they believed.
Do you know that? What source do you have for thinking that a bunch of the disciples were willing to be killed for what they believed? I'll grant you Paul. If the stories in Acts have a grain of truth, which I believe they do, Paul likely faced persecution but continued to preach. It reports Peter getting arrested twice, once in Acts 4 with John and once in Acts 12. That's it. We don't see any other persecution of Peter and John. Being willing to get arrested, especially when you get released both times, is hardly evidence of being willing to die. In addition to the Acts accounts of James' death, we have in Book 7 of his outlines Clement of Alexandria, not Clement of Rome, relating the story of a man who was brought into court with James, who was so moved by his testimony that he also confessed Christ. They were both, therefore, he says, led away together, and on the same way he begged James to forgive him. And he, after considering a little, said, "Peace be with thee," and kissed him. And they were both beheaded at the same time. Sean McDowell notes in his dissertation, Keener concludes, since it is doubtful that Luke would have known such a story and not reported it, or that it was known in his day but not reported to Luke, with the rest of the account, it appears improbable enough that we may ascribe the story to legendary embellishment. Nevertheless, it is interesting that Clement does confirm the death of James by beheading, as reported by Luke, even if he adds this additional tale. The tradition of his death was firm by this time and taken for granted. Thus, I grant you that James did die as a martyr. But did he also die willingly? Could he have saved his life by recanting? Did Herod execute him because of his religious beliefs? Those questions we cannot answer, and thus we cannot draw any conclusions about the historical accuracy of such claims.
Weren't you just reading a book about this?
Yes. It's by Sean McDowell, and it's called The Fate of the Apostles. It was his PhD dissertation, I believe.
Nice.
And what he did was he looked at the evidence for how many of the disciples were actually martyred. And he ended up breaking them up into four categories. Those who were pretty certainly martyred for their faith, those who were probably martyred for their faith, those who were probably not, at least as far as we can prove with evidence, and those who were almost certainly not, at least and as far as we could prove with the evidence. And so several of them were almost certainly martyred. We don't have the evidence to say that 11 of the 12 were actually martyred, as I often hear people say.
Right.
But the important part, as you mentioned, is that the evidence does show that every one of them was willing to lose their life for what they knew to be true.
Sean does make this claim, but based on what? How could anyone know the state of mind of a bunch of first-century men that left us with no record of what they were thinking? We can't possibly know this. He based his conclusion partly on their deaths having taken place hundreds of miles apart at different times. I see this more in support of the possibility that they didn't die willingly. They may never have heard of what happened to the others, as the state of communication over vast areas was sketchy at best. If they had no idea that their colleagues had died, they would have no reason to think their own lives to be in danger, and thus the question of whether they would be willing to die for this may never have even crossed their minds. He does make a good point that had any of them recanted, that would have provided Christian opponents, like Celsus and Lucian, with ammunition against Christianity. And while this is a good point, it still doesn't get us into the minds of the disciples. Even if they never recanted their faith, that still doesn't mean that they were willing to die for it. And since it is unlikely that all of them died for their faith, and even likely that several did not, I don't think we can confidently make any kinds of claims as to what they may or may not have been willing to do. For all we know, several of them may have simply gone back to being fishermen and never gave Christianity another thought. Since they disappear from the gospel after Acts 6, we get no clue from that source as to what they did with the rest of their lives. We do have other sources about their later lives, but these are written long after the events that they portray, and they include fanciful stories that historians agree are legends. Thus, even if all the disciples died for their faith, a fact that cannot be established by the historical data, we cannot know if they did so willingly. Sean takes the opposite tack.
Ready to tack.
Ready to tack?
He makes the claim in his dissertation that though we can't establish historicity that all of the disciples died for their faith, he believes that we can confidently say that they would have been willing to do so. However, his reasoning is built on their having all seen a risen Jesus, for which he relies entirely on the biblical narrative and the accounts in Acts 1:3 and 5:29 that the apostles were persecuted. I find neither of these persuasive. First, because I don't know that all of the disciples saw a risen Jesus. And going back to the purpose of this video, that is the point Rose is supposed to be supporting. If the support for the point that Jesus' resurrection was a historical event requires one to presuppose the truth of the biblical narrative that the disciples witnessed such an event in order to support your supporting claim, you have just presupposed your entire point that you were trying to make in the first place. This is so common with excusages. You just presuppose the Bible to be historical, and then it's easy to establish the historical accuracy of anything in it. As to Sean's second point, that the disciples didn't fall away following persecution, we don't know this. Even if every word of the narrative is historical fact, that still only gets you to they believed it immediately after facing persecution, which is common. It isn't at all unusual for persecution to cause a movement to grow, not shrink. An illustration I read was of stepping on a glass. When you do so, the shattered fragments spread. Keep stepping on it, and the fragments continue to scatter. My point is twofold. First, the persecution of the apostles would likely cause the growth of Christianity, regardless of whether or not it was true, just as persecution causes the growth of other religions. Thus, the spread of Christianity during a time of persecution is not unexpected. Second, we have no idea what happened to most of the disciples after this. Maybe some of them were like me and realized long afterward that the claims of Christianity are hopelessly contradictory and incoherent. They may have quietly withdrawn from their faith, never to be heard from again. And while I don't know that this happened, I also don't know that it didn't.
True. And again,
Right,
they
and-
were in a position to know what was true.
Yeah, and nobody recanted. None
Right.
of those apostles
Right.
recanted.
You cannot know this. We weren't there. There is no transcript of these deaths. In fact, for most of them, there are no records at all of their deaths. For all you know, a couple of them might have recanted and begged for their lives, but were put to death anyway, because the reason they were being put to death was political or they were seen as troublemakers. They were not being put to death because of what they believed. Thus, recanting would not have saved their lives. We don't know that they were even put to death. We don't know if some didn't recant and remain quiet about their beliefs until the end of their days. There is very weak evidence, as Rose has already acknowledged, for many of them having died martyrs' deaths. For the disciples to believe until the end of their days and then die a natural death is neither remarkable nor something that needs to be explained. Christians have been doing that for over 2 millennia. That these particular people lived and died as believers falls in the category of so what? It sure as hell isn't resurrection data. The problem is that Knight and Rose are working with the presupposition that the disciples were witnesses to a resurrection. But that's the very fact they are trying to prove. If the only way to prove that there was a resurrection is to presuppose that there were witnesses to the event, then you have presupposed the event, not provided data to support it.
Right.
All right. How about this one? This one is the most popular one, at least it was until recently. So the hallucination theory. All right. This was popular in the 1990s, advocated by really good atheist historians like Dr. Gerhard Ludemann. It posits that Jesus' disciples only thought they saw the resurrected Jesus.
Now, they finally arrive at what is the biggest challenge to the resurrection data. However, Knight has presented only one possible option under this theory. The more robust response, in my opinion, and Bart Ehrman put his seal of approval on it, is Pelagia's minimal witnesses theory. There were only one or possibly two hallucinations. Most likely Peter had such a hallucination, and all the other reports of seeing Jesus were based on the one that actually had a hallucination. Very like the Elvis sightings, many of which were just people seeking attention, because they knew that claiming to having seen Elvis would likely get them a media interview. I don't think the motivation for others claiming having seen a risen Jesus was attention-seeking. In fact, I have no reason to think that anyone other than Peter even claimed to have seen a risen Jesus. Rather, after Peter said he saw Jesus, stories of a risen Jesus began to circulate. And as stories are passed along, they grow. One person tells a friend that Peter saw a risen Jesus, and that person tells another friend. This third person questions if it couldn't have been a hallucination or vision. So person B adds that all of the disciples were there and they all saw it. Eventually, these stories come to the authors of the Gospels, who write them down some 20 to 40 years later, after the stories have been circulated and being changed a bit for decades. Now, when they get written down, we get the accounts of multiple people having seen Jesus, despite there only having been one person who had a bereavement hallucination, and that was Peter. Bereavement hallucinations are a common occurrence. There is nothing in this theory that is anything other than mundane claims. I sincerely doubt that Rose will address this possibility. I should note that the rumor of Jesus having appeared to 500 had to have been circulating earlier than the writing of the Gospels. Since it is included in the 1 Corinthians Creed, it had to have been written sometime prior to the writing of 1 Corinthians. Could rumors of vast numbers of people seeing an event they did not see arise soon after the event? Absolutely. Just one day after a rally, Trump started spreading the rumor that 1 million people had attended that rally. Photos of the rally tell a very different story. However, Trump's followers continued to believe that there were 1 million people there, because Trump told them so.
But actually, they were all hallucinating. Again, I see some problems, but you get first crack at this, so why don't you take it away?
Yeah. So Dr. Ludemann and others get this idea from grief-based hallucinations, but Paul in particular would not have had a grief-based hallucination involving Jesus.
Okay, but even Paul himself does not claim to have seen a risen Jesus. He says he had a vision of Jesus. Since this is after the alleged ascension, unless Paul was the sole witness to the second coming, he could not possibly have seen a bodily resurrected Jesus. If you count Paul's experience as having seen a risen Jesus, then you must also consider whether the people at Lourdes and Fatima saw a risen Mary. Even Catholics don't claim these sightings were a resurrected Mary. Second, despite not being a friend of Jesus, he could have reconsidered what he was doing to the followers of Jesus and begun to feel empathy for their plight. This, in turn, could have caused the vision.
He wasn't friends with Jesus. He boasted of killing Christians. He was proud of it. He certainly would not have been grieving Jesus' death. Yet another problem for the hallucination theory is that hallucinations occur in the mind. They're not group events. They're not contagious. They're actually a lot like dreams.
No, they are not a lot like dreams, because the person experiencing it actually sees the person there, even though they are not. They are often accompanied by auditory hallucinations, where the person talks too. We see this commonly in movies and TV shows, where a character is seeing and talking to someone who we know is dead.
What do you want from me?
I want to know who you are.
I don't know who I am. Who are you talking to?
Sometimes it is portrayed as being in a dreamlike state, but often the experiences are so real they think they really saw the dead person. And this is common. The group experience is another matter. Rose is right that groups of people do not have the same hallucinations simultaneously. However, group appearances are not a minimal fact to be explained. Since the scholars don't agree that there were any group appearances, this is not a thing that needs to be explained.
Yeah.
These resurrection appearances occurred over 40 days to different groups of people of different sizes, in different states of mind, and with different relationships to Jesus.
And again, you have that data only if you presuppose that the gospel accounts are true. If you presuppose that the gospel accounts are true, you have already presupposed the resurrection, the very point you are trying to support. If you want to make the claim that the resurrection was a historical event, you need historical data to support each point, including the claim that there were group appearances.
As 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7 attests, the largest group to interact with the resurrected Jesus at one time was 500 people. And actually, I believe the text says 500 men. So there were probably even more people there,
Yeah.
including women and children.
It says 500 of his followers, which included women. But regardless, once again, you have presupposed that this creed is based on historical data when you have provided no evidence of such data.
This is nothing like any hallucination event ever recorded.
I don't know about that. It doesn't sound much different than the alleged events at Fatima, where in 1917, approximately 70,000 people all claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky in response to the prayers of 3 children that claimed to have seen Mary. Group hallucination? Possibly. There are other explanations that are more likely, but the point is that this event was much bigger than 500, and the people there claim to have witnessed a miracle. Their stories are recorded in the newspapers of the day, written by unbiased reporters. A miracle they claim was done by your God, and yet you don't accept this miracle. Why do you reject Fatima when we have photographs of the event and written accounts of the event recorded early, but you accept the appearance of Jesus to 500 unknown witnesses in an unknown location at an unknown time with no evidence to support such claim? I think I know the answer.
Who talks about having a dream at night, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then waking up and saying, hey, sweetie, I'm having this amazing dream. Come in my dream with me and we're going to have this amazing vacation.
And yeah, he's in Hawaii, and he
right.
wakes up his wife and goes, hey, go back to sleep and come into my dream.
They are right that this doesn't happen. Now provide historical evidence that there really were group appearances. Once again, this is not included in Gary Habermas's minimal facts, as it is not a point accepted by most historical and biblical scholars.
It's
Okay.
great.
All right, let's
Yeah.
do one more. I think there's
Okay.
one more. Oh no, we have 2 more.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one is quick, but
Yeah.
people believe this one. So this is called the legend one. So
Mhm.
the belief in the resurrection develops over time. I
Right.
mean, this is okay. Yeah, I mean, you get to go ahead and tell us what's wrong with this. But do you think that the belief in the resurrection could have developed over a long period of time, like maybe hundreds of years later, somebody came up with this? And
Why hundreds of years? Maybe because you know the Gospels were written a few decades after the events that they depict? But the stories absolutely could have grown up within a few decades. The stories about the 2020 election having been stolen grew in a few months, despite no evidence ever having been produced to support those claims.
maybe hundreds of years later, somebody came up with this. And
Absolutely not. No. For one thing, it rejects the early proclamation of the bodily resurrection of Jesus, which is abundantly attested.
The early proclamations of Jesus having been resurrected is abundantly attested? Interesting. If that were true, why did it not make it into Gary Habermas's minimal facts? Or are you making up your own minimal facts at this point? If this is so abundantly attested, why is it that historical scholars aren't seeing this data? Please, Rose, share the data of this abundant testimony.
Very strongly supported by the evidence.
Yeah.
And as we
I
discussed
mean, it's in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. As we said in episode 1, like scholars across a broad ideological spectrum believe 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 is an ancient creed dating back to within 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion. So there you have the appearances, you have the resurrection proclamation, you've got the death of Jesus, and Paul is writing it. He says he has an appearance. So there's just no time for legends about the core facts of the resurrection narrative to creep in.
Knight is conflating scholars accepting that the creed was used early to mean that it was fact-based. This is not accepted by scholars. I think Knight would acknowledge the prayers said by Muslim believers, but would not accept that what they say in their prayers is true, right? What is in the creed is vague. It simply claims that Jesus was buried and raised on the third day. It isn't even accurate. It claims these things to be according to the scriptures, but they are not. There are no Old Testament prophecies that predict the Messiah would rise from the dead, let alone that it would happen in 3 days. According to the Gospel Coalition, where is it written that Christ would rise on the third day? To find the answer, we must remember that the Old Testament has more than one way of pointing to Christ. We often think first of explicit predictions, but we come up dry in our search for Messiah raised on the third day predictions, because as far as I know, there are none. It then goes on to claim that some of the Old Testament stories point to such a possibility because Isaac was spared, Jonah was saved from the whale after 3 days, Moses has the people prepare for 3 days to hear the law, and so on. But none of these are prophecies about a Messiah to come that this creed could possibly be referring to.
Exactly. Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay, this one is yours. So you have one more. So
one
tell us
more.
about it. Yes.
So this one's my favorite because it makes me laugh. So when I talk to, let me give just a background sentence or two. When I talk to non-Christians, okay, I like to ask them, so how do you account for the facts agreed upon by virtually all scholars of all religions surrounding the death and appearances of Jesus? How do you explain these? How do you account?
And if Rose were to ask me that question, I would first ask what facts she was referring to. If she responded with the minimal facts she began this broadcast with, I would ask what it is that she wants me to account for. All we get from the minimal facts is that Jesus died by crucifixion, that the disciples reported experience they believed to have been appearances by Jesus, that the disciples' lives were transformed by these experiences. James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul also had experiences that they interpreted as having seen Jesus after his death. None of these make any claim to a historical resurrection. Not one. So what is it, Rose, that I am supposed to explain? According to the title of your video, I'm supposed to give you an alternative explanation as to what happened that explains these facts if it wasn't a historical resurrection. It's one you haven't considered here, the minimal witnesses theory. The theory that there was in fact only 2 experiences of having seen Jesus after he died, these by Peter and Paul, and from these 2 experiences, the creed, the stories of others seeing a risen Jesus, all grew, to where you eventually end up with the accounts that are in the Gospels. Is this a sufficient explanation for you, Rose? What in it doesn't fit with the historical data points? How is this not a better interpretation of the data, as it doesn't require you to presuppose miraculous events to explain it?
So most people have not thought about this question at all. They have usually no response.
I'll grant Rose that. Most unbelievers don't really care about what you believe and don't give it much thought. The odd thing about this remark is that I often get the opposite pushback. Christians ask me why I spend so much of my time thinking about, writing about, and pushing back on Christianity. If you are a Christian and you want me to consider your claims, then you must also accept the criticism that I have of your claims. If you want to avoid the criticism, then don't ask me to think about and consider what you believe. Or is the point that you want me to simply accept that what you believe is true without thinking about it or considering whether or not it really is true? Are you asking me to check my brain at the door and have blind faith? If so, that's a hard pass.
Other people may have heard some things here and there. They may repeat one of the debunked naturalistic explanations that we've just talked about. But others are actually really informed on the subject. They follow the scholarship. They're updated on the conversation. They know the problems with all of these naturalistic explanations that we've just talked about, but they don't want to admit that the resurrection is true. They don't like the conclusion, right, and the implications of it.
No, Rose, the reason I don't think a resurrection really happened has nothing to do with whether or not I want it to be true or any implications that might have. Suppose Jesus really did rise from the dead. Would that mean that all of the other claims in the Bible are true? It would not. Would it mean that Jesus died for your sins and he wants you to believe that? It would not. It would be evidence of a supernatural event. I'll grant that, and that would be huge if it existed. But the data simply does not support that as the most reasonable conclusion.
Their answer is something happened. And I think that is so funny when I ask people, what do you think happened? And they're like, something happened. Well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, billions of people believe in Christianity because something happened. The question is, what happened? And the fact is, this is not an explanation. This is a cop-out. This is a rejection of the conclusion. It's not an interaction with the evidence.
Rose, do you answer this question as to other religions? Billions of people are Muslim. Does that mean the angel Gabriel really did give the Quran to Muhammad? After all, something happened to cause so many people to convert to this religion. Billions of people believe in Hinduism. Does that mean that Vishnu, Shiva, and other deities from that religion are real because you don't have an alternative explanation of how this religion came to be? If billions of people believing in other religions isn't evidence for the truth of their beliefs, why should billions of people believing in your religion be proof of your religion's truth?
Well, I think the most important thing is that the best explanation for the facts that are agreed upon by virtually every scholar, regardless of worldview, who has studied the evidence, is that Jesus actually rose from the dead, literally and bodily.
And yet those same scholars that have studied this do not reach that conclusion. Why do you suppose that is? Surely you cannot conclude that most historians simply don't want to accept the truth, do you? I think you need to answer your own question as to historians. If the historians look at the data and don't see a miraculous bodily risen Jesus as you do, why do you consider your take the better interpretation of the data? I am no historian, but some of my friends are, and they would tell you that history is determined by drawing the most reasonable conclusion from the data points. Just because you think a miraculous event is the most reasonable conclusion, the fact that the majority of historical scholars disagree tells me you are looking at this wrong. You are looking at this trying to support your presuppositions. This is not how we determine history. Your degree is in theology. This is the way that one establishes theology, by presupposing the theology to be right and then trying to support it. So I get why you are coming at the problem from the direction that you do. But just because this makes the conclusion logical from a theological viewpoint doesn't mean it does so from a historical viewpoint. Because it doesn't meet the criteria for a reasonable historical conclusion, and thus is not a historical event. The last 3 minutes of the video is off topic and attempts to resurrect a horse that we have beaten to death many times on this channel. I hope you have enjoyed Knight and Rose. Unfortunately, they didn't address the most robust of the alternative explanations, the minimal witnesses theory. Since Bart Ehrman featured that theory on his blog with Paulogia as a guest author, this is likely to be making the rounds with textual critics and will eventually be a point that the excusagists will need to address. They also raise the issue that they feel every non-Christian needs to explain how Paul could have had a vision that changed his life. Not only did I offer an alternative explanation, that Paul's change came first and the vision was a reflection of his feelings, which gave voice to his inner turmoil and direction for him to redeem himself from his own ghosts. But I also raised their bid.
I see your bet and raise you.
To challenge them to explain how a loving God can do whatever it takes to convince the Apostle Paul to follow him, yet despite wanting everyone to believe in him, he either cannot or will not do whatever it takes to reach everyone. Not only does their God fail to reach everyone, their God doesn't even reach the majority of people. Why is the God of Knight and Rose such a colossal failure at his own life's work? Live your life.